First thing they took was my name. Not my freedom, they left me that, in a manner of speaking, because a dead woman with no legal standing cannot be imprisoned. Not my title, because you cannot confiscate what the record says never existed. Took the name first, and everything else followed. From that, the way a structure follows the removal of a single load-bearing stone, they struck it from the Imperial Register of Living Persons. They struck it from the Succession Codex. They struck it from the census rolls of every world I had ever governed, from the service records of every officer who had ever sworn to me, the memory of every institution that a name, once removed, could be made to forget. Then they waited for me to stop existing. I did not stop. That is the part they failed to account for. The architects of the erasure were thorough. I will grant them that, even now. But thoroughness and completeness are not the same thing, and they knew only the records they had reason to know. They knew the imperial systems. They knew the Soothcaran dynastic archive. They knew the ecclesiastical census, the military rolls, the trade guild registers, the planetary birth and death ledgers that fed into the Central Galactic Registry every third year. They audited every node in the network they themselves had built, and they were satisfied, and they declared me legally dead by administrative determination on the 14th day of the month of quiet fires, 11 years and 3 months before I stood in the Meridian Stationton Claims Tribunal and heard a human records officer ask for the floor. His name was Corvin Masta. I did not know it then. I should begin at the beginning of that day, because the day itself nearly ended before he spoke. The tribunal had been in session for 9 hours. I had been standing at the petitioner's podium for 6 of them. Standing, because my counsel had advised that I would be taken more seriously on my feet than in a chair, though I suspected the real reason was that a standing petitioner looks more like a supplicant, and the tribunal's 3 arbiters were the sort of officials who preferred their supplicants vertical. The chamber was tall and cold, the way all Meridian architecture is tall and cold. Vaulted ceilings of pale composite material, light strips running in parallel lines overhead like the ribs of something enormous that had died and been converted into infrastructure. The gallery above filled with observers who had arrived with varying degrees of hope for my success, and, as the hours accumulated, varying degrees of resignation. I had presented what I had. There had been more, once, but attrition is the enemy of the long case. An elder's testimony from the Veth Protectorate. Struck down, on the grounds that elders of that sect were historically unreliable witnesses in imperial proceedings. This was a circular ruling, and my counsel had pointed out its circularity, and the pointing out had not helped. The arbiters had the authority to determine witness credibility, and they were exercising it, and the exercise left no room for appeal within the current proceeding. A ceremonial artifact bearing my lineage mark, submitted with a provenance affidavit from a specialist I had located after considerable effort, struck down, on the grounds that lineage marks could be forged, and that the authenticating body for lineage mark provenance was the Imperial Registry itself, which had already determined that no such lineage existed. The circularity of this ruling was, if anything, more elegant than the first, and I had watched the usurper's representative, a sleek and unhurried man named Preth, absorb it with the composed satisfaction of someone enjoying a particularly well-constructed piece of machinery. A sworn deposition from my first chamberlain, taken before his death 2 years prior, struck down, on the grounds that the deponent was deceased and could not be cross-examined. The deposition had taken me 3 years to locate and another 2 years to have legally prepared, and it had been dismissed in approximately 4 minutes. 2 planetary residency records from worlds I had governed before the erasure, struck down, because both records had been subject to the same imperial administrative reorganization that had removed my name from every other document, and the arbiters found them internally inconsistent with the current registry in a way that reflected poorly on their reliability. It did not matter that the inconsistency was the result of deliberate falsification. Proving that the falsification was deliberate was exactly what the tribunal was supposed to be deciding, and the arbiters were not prepared to assume its conclusion in order to admit evidence that would support it. I had watched each ruling land with the quiet precision of a demolition. My counsel had argued each one, and argued well, and it had made no difference. And by the time the 6th hour became the 7th, I understood what the tribunal was doing. They were not adjudicating. They were performing an adjudication, which is a very different thing. The outcome had been determined before I arrived. The South Karen usurpers, who now held my throne, had friends on this station. Credits in the right accounts, favors accumulated over 11 years of administering a house that was not theirs, and the deep structural advantage of simply being the thing that was already in place. A dead woman does not simply walk into a galactic court and undie herself. The law does not work that way, and even when the law might be made to work that way, the people who administer the law have interests of their own. I was not despairing. I want to be precise about that, because it matters to the shape of what came next. I have been accused, in the years since, being a woman without ordinary emotions, a woman of unnatural composure, as though composure in extremity were a character flaw rather than a skill that difficulty teaches. That description is not accurate. I had despaired thoroughly. In the 11 years before this day, in the small hours of various nights on various worlds where I was living under names that were not my name and doing work that was not my work, and the despair had been genuine, and I do not minimize it. But I had used it up. I had used it up over 11 years of dead ends and false leads and documents that turned out to be amended, and witnesses who turned out to be afraid, courts that turned out to have already decided. What remained, by the 7th hour of the Meridian Tribunal, was a kind of very cold clarity, the clarity that comes to someone who has prepared for a particular ending and has made as much peace with it as can be made, and is now simply waiting for the formality to conclude. The chief arbiter, a Vacarine woman named Solvith was gathering her papers. That is the gesture I remember most precisely from those last minutes before everything changed. The way her long fingers were moving her documents into a neat stack, the particular efficiency of the motion, the way it communicated that we are nearly done here without requiring her to say so. The gallery had grown quieter. The way crowds grow quiet when they have finished hoping for one outcome and are beginning to adjust to another. My counsel, a Thrinosi advocate named Vlashon, who had worked this case for 4 years without compensation because she had decided it was important, had stopped taking notes. The usurper's representative, Preth, was permitting himself a small private smile. It was then that a voice from the records gallery, the lower gallery, set off to the side, where the attending officers and archivists sat with their documentation terminals during evidentiary proceedings, said, particular quality of someone who is not accustomed to addressing tribunals, but has decided to do so anyway. Arbiter Solvith, if you would permit, I have an additional exhibit to enter into the record. Solvith looked up from her papers. She looked in the direction of the voice, with the expression of a woman who has been interrupted while closing a door and is deciding whether to simply continue closing it. The man who had spoken was human. He was seated at the second row of the records gallery, surrounded by the kind of documentation that accumulates around a person who has been working very seriously for a long time. Physical binders, stacked in a slightly precarious tower to his left. Several flat archive tablets arranged in a careful row in front of him. He was perhaps late 30s, or somewhere in the territory of age that a human reaches when their youth is fully behind them, and they are not yet old, what I have since learned to read as the weathered middle distance of a life spent doing careful, unglamorous, necessary work. Dark hair, close cropped. A jaw that had encountered some difficulty at some point and remembered it in the set of the bone. He was wearing the gray uniform of an imperial adjacent records service, though the insignia was not quite imperial, something subcontracted, something operating in the margins of the central administrative structure. He did not look like a man who expected to change anything. He looked like a man who had decided to try. The record is essentially closed, Solvith said. It was not quite a refusal. Refusal would have been more merciful and quicker. I understand, the man said. I would ask only 10 minutes of the court's time. The exhibit is a primary document from a non-imperial registry. It was not available to the petitioner's counsel because its cataloging system is not integrated with the standard galactic search apparatus. He paused, and in the pause there was something precise and deliberate, a beat of Nothing that functioned as an acknowledgement of the inconvenience, and a refusal to be stopped by it. It took me some time to locate it. I apologize for the late hour. Preth had stopped smiling. That was the first thing I noticed. Not what the man had said, because I had not yet understood what the man had said, but the fact that Preeth had stopped smiling. The quality of attention he was now giving the records gallery was the attention of a man who has encountered an unexpected variable and is very quickly trying to determine its significance. In 11 years of being a dead woman, I had learned to read rooms the way some people learn to read weather, not as an academic exercise but as a survival skill. And I read that room in that moment with every faculty I possessed, and what I read was, Preeth did not know this man was here. Solvithur set down her papers. 10 minutes, she said. Enter your name and credentials for the record. Corvin Mast, he said. Imperial Adjunct Records Service, Colonial Division. My certification number is in the exhibit header. He stood, and he gathered his documents, and he carried them to the floor of the chamber, and that is when things began to change. I want to describe what he did, because it is not the sorts of thing that gets described accurately in the later accounts. The later accounts, the histories, the official summaries, the ones that were produced after the verdict, when everyone had an interest in the shape of the story, tend to render what happened in that chamber as a dramatic revelation, a sudden flood of light, a moment of triumph. It was not that. What Corvan Maste did in those 10 minutes, in the 40 additional minutes that followed, because Solvithur kept granting him extensions, was deeply, fundamentally unglamorous. It was the work of an archivist. It was the work of a man who had spent a long time in the company of records and had learned, practice and temperament, to trust them vent more than he trusted the people who administered them. He explained in his quiet and unhurried way, been conducting a review of colonial-era population registries for a completely separate matter. An inheritance dispute involving a family on one of the outer settlement worlds. Nothing that touched the South Karen succession in any way that would have been visible from the outside. In the course of that review, he had accessed the Human Colonial Compact's own population archive, which predated the current imperial administrative framework by 60 years and had never been integrated into the standard galactic registration network. The Compact's archive was, he explained, technically not an imperial document. It had been maintained by a human administrative body under a separate charter. It had never been subject to imperial audit. It had never been subject to imperial amendment. It existed in a system that the people who had designed the erasure had not thought to consider, because the people who had designed the erasure were primarily concerned with the galactic systems they themselves controlled. He set the first document on the arbiter's table. It was a diplomatic registry entry, 62 years old. Compact standard formatting, the slightly archaic typography of mid-period compact administrative procedure. It recorded, in the methodical and unsentimental language of bureaucratic acknowledgement, presence of a South Karen royal delegation on compact-administered threshold station, and the names and titles of each delegation member, and amongst those names, in plain text in a document that had been sitting in a human archive for 60 years because no one had thought it mattered, was the lineage of my house, going back 4 generations, cross-referenced against a compact-issued diplomatic credential number. The lineage recorded on this document, Corvan Maste said, matches the lineage claimed by the petitioner in her initial submission, which was rejected on the grounds that no corroborating record existed in any recognized registry. He let that sit for a moment, not for dramatic effect. I do not think he thought in those terms, but because he was giving the arbiters time to read, and reading takes time, and he respected that. He set a second document beside the first. This one was a trade compact, 47 years old, between the compact's Outer Settlement Authority and the South Karen Governing House, concerning grain transport rights, through a particular navigational corridor that ran adjacent to a system my house had administered for 3 generations. The signatory on behalf of the South Karen House was listed with full dynastic notation, the specific succession line that traced through 4 subsequent document generations to me. This document was executed under compact commercial law, Corvin Maesta said. It was not subject to imperial registration requirements. It exists in the Compact's commercial archive, in its original form, and has not been amended. He sets a third document on the table. I had stopped breathing in any way that was visible. I was standing at the petitioner's podium and my hands were on the rail, and I was watching a man I had never met lay out, one document at a time, the bones of a history that had been declared not to exist. He was not dramatic about it. He was not triumphant. He spoke in the measured, faintly dry register of someone presenting evidence to a body that should have had this evidence long ago and had simply failed to look for it in the place. There was no anger in his voice. There was no satisfaction of the vindictive kind. He sounded, above everything, like a man who found the situation professionally embarrassing, not for himself, but for the court, for the administrative systems that the court represented. The third document was a population census. Compact format, 39 years old, one of the settled moons in a system that had been, at the time of the census, under joint compact imperial administration. It had been taken during a period when the moon's population included a significant number of non-human residents, and the compact had recorded them with the same bureaucratic thoroughness it applied to everyone else, which is the thing about good administrative practice. It does not select its subjects, and there, in the population registry of that moon, in a category labeled diplomatic resident, non-capped, was a name, my full name, with my full dynastic lineage, and my age at the time of the census, and a notation indicating that I was the present in an official capacity on behalf of the South Karen ruling house. I was 7 years old in that census. It was a census of a moon I had visited with my mother on a diplomatic tour, because she believed that the people, who would eventually govern, should first understand what they were governing, and she had taken me along as often as was practical. Neither of us had thought, at the time, that anyone would ever need to prove we had existed. You do not think about that when you are 7, and you are a princess, and the world is simply what it is. The individual recorded in this census, Corvin Maesta said, is consistent in age, lineage, and title with the petitioner as she has represented herself. The age at census aligns with the petitioner's stated age by a margin of less than 4 months, is within the administrative rounding standard of the Compact's census protocol. Preeth was on his feet. The Compact's records are not recognized by this tribunal as primary sources under. They are recognized under Article 14 of the Meridian. Station Records Compact, Corvin Maesta said, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not rush. And there was in his tone the specific quality of someone who anticipated this objection and prepared for it several days in advance, which your government signed 11 years ago. As part of the same administrative reorganization that established the current Claims Tribunal, CES. Article 14 recognizes compact archival records as admissible in proceedings before any tribunal operating under Meridian jurisdiction where no conflicting imperial record exists. In this case, there is no conflicting imperial record, because the imperial record was amended to remove the petitioner's existence. The compact record was not amended. The compact record cannot be amended by imperial administrative action. It says what it has always said. A silence entered the chamber that was different from the silences that had preceded it. The gallery was not making the gradual quieting sound of a crowd losing interest. It was making no sound at all. Velashan, my counsel, had her stylus raised above her tablet, and was not moving it because she was not writing. She was watching. Solvith was looking at the documents on her table with the particular stillness of a woman who is reading very carefully and does not wish to be interrupted. Preeth sat back down. The motion was precise and controlled, but it was the control of someone managing something, and the management was visible to anyone who had been watching him all day. I had been watching him all day. Corvin Maesta continued. He explained, a total of 14 documents from the Compact's various archival divisions, population records, diplomatic records, commercial records, and one navigational log from a jointly operated way station that had recorded the transit of a South Karen royal vessel and its passenger manifest 31 years ago on a route that was consistent with official South Karen diplomatic movements of that period. He would like to enter all 14 into the record. He would also note, for the court's consideration, that each document was time-stamped to a period before the imperial administrative reorganization, which was to say, before the reorganization that had coincidentally resulted in the amendment of the Sothkaran dynastic record and the administrative determination of the petitioner's death. None of these documents was subject to that reorganization, he said. None of them was subject to any subsequent audit. They exist because they were filed by human administrative bodies under human administrative law, and they record what they record because they were never asked to record anything different. He set the remaining 11 documents on the arbiter's table, one at a time, with the careful deliberation of a man who wants each piece of evidence to be clearly visible and clearly distinct. A man who has thought, seriously and in advance, about the procedural weight of the moment, and has arranged accordingly. Then he stepped back. "I have nothing further," he said. "The documents speak for themselves." They did. The authentication took 3 hours. 3 hours during which I sat in a small room off the main chamber with Velashan and 2 members of the authentication panel who asked me careful, methodical questions about each document's content, cross-referencing my answers against details I should not have been able to provide if I were not who I said I was. The name of the chamberlain who had accompanied the delegation to Threshold Station, the specific navigational designation of the corridor covered by the grain transport compact, the name of the moon's administrative governor at the time of the census. Questions designed to catch an impersonator. Questions that I answered because I had been there. And the answers were simply the truth, and the truth is a thing that does not require construction. Velashan stopped looking resigned, and had started looking like someone experiencing a particular kind of vertigo. The vertigo of unexpected altitude, the dizziness of a summit that was not supposed to exist. She is not a woman given to visible emotion in professional settings, and she kept her composure. I could see in the set of her shoulders the thing she was not saying, which was, this might actually work. In the chamber beyond our door, Preth had requested a recess and been denied. He had requested that the documents be treated as potentially fraudulent pending independent review by an imperial-appointed panel, a panel which, conveniently, would be composed of members appointed by the current Sothkaran administration, and had been denied on the grounds that the compact's archival authentication protocols were among the most rigorous in the settled systems, and a second view request without demonstrated evidentiary basis for fraud constituted a procedural delay. He had submitted a formal objection which was logged, changed nothing. He had sat very still for a long time after that. Corvinmost, I learned later, had remained in the records gallery throughout the authentication process, answering questions from the panel's documentation specialist with the same unhurried patience he had shown in presenting the originals. He answered questions about the provenance of each document, the condition of the archive in which it was held, the access protocols he had followed in retrieving it. He had the answers because he had prepared them. He had prepared them because he is the kind of man who, when he undertakes a thing, undertakes it completely. I want to tell you what I was thinking in that small room during the 3 hours of authentication, because the record of what a person thinks in the critical hours is as important as the record of what is said and done. I was thinking about my mother, about the diplomatic tour when I was 7, and the way she had guided me through the census registration on that moon with her hand on my shoulder, because children of 7 do not always enjoy standing still while officials take their names and lineage for administrative purposes, and she had made it feel like something more than a formality. She had said, in the way she had of making institutional processes feel worth caring about, every record is a promise that you were here. I had not thought about that for a very long time. I had also thought, in the 11 years of being declared dead, that I was past the kind of feeling that arrives when someone does something unexpected and right. You develop a protection against that feeling when you have spent years watching people decline to see you. When courts and registries and official bodies look at you with the particular expression of people who have decided, for administrative reasons, not to acknowledge what is standing in front of them. You learn not to depend on being seen. You learn to absorb the not seeing as a condition rather than an event, the way you absorb cold. Not through indifference, through the slow reallocation of resources away from hoping for warmth. And then, occasionally, someone sees you anyway, and the protection turns out to be less complete than you believed. My eyes were doing what eyes do when a body is processing something it was not paired to process. Bright in the way that has nothing to do with weakness. Everything to do with the specific shock of being treated as real, by someone with no obligation to make the effort. The panel returned its authentication finding at the end of the 3rd hour. 14 documents, all authenticated, all predating the Imperial Administrative Reorganization. All consistent with the petitioner's stated lineage and identity by a margin that the panel characterized, in its written finding, as statistically indistinguishable from a direct match. The panel further noted, in language that was quite careful and quite pointed, that the discrepancy between the compact records and the current Imperial Administrative Record not be explained by ordinary administrative variation or record-keeping error, and recommended that the tribunal consider the implications of a systematic discrepancy of this nature for the validity of the Imperial Record in its form. It was, for a panel finding, remarkably close to an accusation. Solveth returned to the chamber. She did not look at Preeth. She looked at me. She said, "Petitioner Vailindra Soth Karen, the tribunal finds that the administrative determination of your death, issued 14 years ago by amendment to the Imperial Register of Living Persons, is inconsistent with the primary evidence now before this court. Pursuant to Article 14 of the Meridian Station Records Compact and the evidentiary standards of this tribunal, that determination is vacated. The Soth Karen dynastic record will be referred to the Imperial Correction Panel for amendment. Corrections will proceed on an expedited basis. This tribunal will maintain oversight jurisdiction pending the conclusion of the amendment process." She paused. Solveth had been a jurist for 30 years, and in 30 years she had acquired the particular quality of stillness that some officials develop when they are about to say something they know will be remembered, and want to be sure it is said correctly. "The record," she said, "does not forget simply because it has been asked to." The gallery above was silent for a moment, the particular held-breath silence of people who just been told something that will require them to revise their understanding of what was possible today. And then, it was not silent at all. I do not have a precise memory of the next several minutes. There is a compression that happens in moments of that magnitude, a collapse of sequential time, so that what you retain are fragments without connective tissue. My counsel's hand on my arm, leaving the chamber. A Soth Karen loyalist in the back of the gallery, one of the few who had dared to come, who had sat in the corner for 9 hours not making eye contact with anyone, standing up, very slowly, the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to be true for a very long time and has just been told that it is. And through all of it, underneath the noise of the gallery, a kind of interior stillness that I did not expect and could not fully account for. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter and deeper than either. The feeling of a person who has been carrying the proof of their own existence for 11 years and has just been permitted, for the first time, to set it down. I walked out of the chamber. The corridor outside the tribunal hall is a long, pale space that connects the hearing rooms to the administrative wing of Meridian Station. During proceedings, it is usually empty because everyone with business in the corridor is inside the chamber. It was nearly empty when I walked into it. Nearly, because there was one person in the corridor seated on the bench along the far wall, spits, a smaller version of the documentation arrangement he had built in the records gallery. He had apparently left the chamber during the authentication period, or perhaps during the gallery response that followed the ruling. I did not know exactly when. And he was packing his binders with methodical care of someone who has finished a job and is managing the administrative aftermath, completion. He looked up when he heard me. He had the expression of someone who is not sure which expression is correct for this situation. Pride. It was not pride, or not the kind that is visible. Not the satisfaction of vindication exactly, though there was something in the neighborhood of it. More like the expression of a man who has been carrying a particular weight of information for a long time and has just set it down in the right place and is still getting used to the absence of it. I stood in the corridor and looked at him, and I said the only true thing I had. You found me. He was quiet for a moment. He is the kind of man who is quiet, not because he has nothing to say, but because he is deciding what is accurate to say, and he does not like to be inaccurate. The census found you, he said. I just knew where to look. It is the sort of answer that is meant to deflect credit. And coming from certain people, it functions that way. A performed modesty, gesture toward generosity. Coming from Corvan Maisty in that corridor, the authentication documents in his arms, and his gray uniform slightly rumpled from a long day, and his jaw set with the quiet steadiness of a man who has done what he came to do, it did not sound like performance. It sounded like he genuinely believed it. He had found the census. The census had found me. To him, the sequence was that simple. How long, I said. He understood what I was asking. 7 weeks. The inheritance case I was working on touched the same archive. I found the first document, the Threshold Station Registry. By accident. He considered this. After the first document, it wasn't an accident anymore. 7 weeks. For 7 weeks, a human archivist in the colonial division of an imperial adjacent records service had been cross-referencing documents in a non-integrated archive, following a thread that had nothing to do with his assigned work and everything to do with a name he had found in the wrong place and decided could not be ignored. He had not been assigned to my case. He had not been retained by my counsel. He had not been commissioned by any interested party, paid, or asked. He had simply found a thing, understood what the finding meant, and spent 7 weeks making certain he could prove it. Compact records were never flagged, he said. The reorganization team didn't audit non-imperial archives. I don't think they knew how extensive the Compact's own population registry was. Or, if they knew, they thought no one would look. He closed the last binder and set it in his carry case, and his hands were steady with the steadiness of someone whose work for the day is complete. They were almost right. Almost. That word sat in the corridor between us with the particular weight of things that were nearly true and turned out not to be. I need to ask you something, I said. Why? He looked at me with the direct, measuring look I had not yet learned to recognize, but have since had years to study. The look of a man who takes questions seriously and therefore takes his time with them. Because the record was wrong, he said. That's my job. The record being wrong is my problem when I find it. It was not a romantic answer. It was not the answer of someone who had done a great thing and was reaching for language adequate to it. It was the answer of a man who considered the integrity of records to be a professional responsibility and who in the course of fulfilling that responsibility happened to undo 11 years of deliberate erasure and who saw no discontinuity between those two things. The very plainness of it was what landed hardest, because I had spent 11 years in a world full of people who had declined, for one reason or another, correct the record. People who had more resources than one archivist in a gray uniform, people with institutional authority and legal standing and direct access to the systems that needed correcting. And here was a man for whom the correction was simply what you did when the record was wrong, regardless of whose record it was. Regardless of who had an interest in its remaining wrong, regardless of whether anyone had asked him. I did not have words adequate to the moment. Words have to adequate for courts and negotiations and the formal registers of diplomatic exchange. But this corridor, with its pale composite walls and its empty bench and this human archivist with his carry case, required a different kind of language. And I found that I was not certain I still possessed it after 11 years of having no one to use it with. Thank you, I said. It was insufficient. I knew it was insufficient. I said it anyway, because sometimes the insufficient thing is the only honest thing, and honest was the least I owed him. He nodded. Not the reflexive nod that turns thank you into a formality and you're welcome into a disposal mechanism. He received it as what it was, an acknowledgement of a real thing, and he gave it a real nod in return, and then he picked up his carry case, and he stood in the corridor for a moment with the quietly settled look of a man who has finished what he came to do. I'll file the supporting documentation with the correction panel, he said. They'll need the provenance chain on all 14 documents. He paused. If your counsel wants to coordinate, my contact information is in the exhibit header. I looked at him. He looked back, the patient directness of a man who is prepared to wait as long as the situation requires. Yes, I said. She'll want to coordinate. He nodded again. This one, the nod of a professional matter concluded, and he walked down the corridor toward the administrative wing, and I watched him go. And I thought, this is what it looks like when someone does the right thing without an audience. This is what it looks like when a person who cares about accuracy cares about it with enough consistency that they care about it, even when the accuracy in question has nothing to do with them. Even when correcting it requires 7 weeks of unreimbursed work, even when the person whose existence has been erased is an alien empress in a gray building on a space station, standing at a petitioner's podium, running out of time. What happened next, in the weeks and months following the tribunal's ruling, was the slow and frequently frustrating process of making the rest of the record consistent with what the compact documents had proved. The Imperial Correction Panel did not move quickly. These bodies never do. They are composed of people with institutional interests in the current state of things. And the current state of things had, for 11 years, included my absence, and absences are comfortable for the people who have organized themselves around them. There were 3 separate attempts to challenge the authentication findings. The first challenged the Compact's archival access protocols. Dismissed, as Corvin Mosta's documentation of his access procedure was meticulous to a degree that the challenging party had apparently not anticipated. Challenges all collapsed under cross-examination in approximately 40 minutes. The second challenged the interpretation of Article 14 of the Meridian Records Compact, arguing that the article's admissibility provision applied only to documents pertaining to Compact citizens, not to alien persons recorded in Compact documents incidentally. This was a more serious argument, and it occupied a sub-panel for 6 weeks before being dismissed, on the grounds that the text of Article 14 contained no such restriction. That restriction could not be read into it without legislative amendment. The third challenge, the most sustained, and the one backed by the most significant resources, argued that the pattern of discrepancy between the Compact records and the Imperial record was explicable by ordinary administrative drift over the relevant period, and did not constitute evidence of deliberate falsification. This argument was dismantled, with considerable care and no audible satisfaction, by Corvin Most himself, in a series of expert testimony sessions before the sub-panel, in which he walked the members through a statistical analysis of the discrepancy, patterns that made the administrative drift explanation mathematically untenable. He was very patient in those sessions. He answered every question. He did not show frustration when the questions revealed that the questioner had not read the documents they were ostensibly challenging, though I suspect he felt it. He maintained throughout the composed and slightly dry precision that was simply his register, the register of a man who has no interest in scoring points and significant interest in being understood. The sub-panel dismissed the challenge. The correction panel proceeded. 8 months after the tribunal ruling, the Imperial Register of Living Persons had a new entry. It was my name. It said, alive. The Soth Karen Succession Codex was amended. The census rolls of the worlds I had governed were corrected. The service records of every officer who had served me were restored. One by one, the institutions that had been asked to forget me were asked to remember. Not all of them found it easy. 11 years is a long time, and institutions have their own momentum, and some of the people who had administered those institutions during my absence had interests in the continuation of that absence. The reconstitution of the Soth Karen House was not a smooth or linear process. There were worlds where the transition was orderly, and the populations had maintained enough institutional memory of the old administration that the new one, which was, of course, the old one, could resume without excessive disruption. There were other worlds where 11 years had allowed the usurper's representatives to build real constituencies, real dependencies, real loyalties of the kind that develop when people have benefited from an arrangement for long enough that they have stopped imagining alternatives. On those worlds, the reconstitution was slower and more complicated and required the kind of patient, unglamorous negotiation that is less interesting to record than dramatic confrontations, but is more consequential. My court was rebuilt. People who had waited and maintained the waiting at personal cost, some for the entire 11 years. People who had not known what they were waiting for until there was suddenly something to return to. From a smaller number of people who were new, who had not known me before the erasure, but who had looked at the tribunal's old evidence and the correction panel's findings, and decided that this was where they wanted to be. Court I rebuilt was not the court I had lost. 11 years changes things. Some of what was changed I would not have wished to reverse. There are improvements in the new court, disciplines and practices and personnel that the old court lacked, and I would not trade them for a clean continuity. Von Mosti received a commendation from the Colonial Division for his work on the authentication. The commendation was primarily about methodology. His approach to non-integrated archive cross-referencing was subsequently formalized into a new protocol that the Colonial Division adopted for its evidentiary review process. Other erasure cases, subsequently brought before tribunals in other jurisdictions, made use of the MAST protocol in recovering records that the Imperial Administrative Reorganization had been unable to reach. I do not have a count of how many persons' existences were restored by the protocol's adoption. Corvin Maste has a count. He is the person who keeps counts, but he does not publish it because he considers it a records management statistic rather than a personal achievement. The commendation ceremony was an internal Colonial Division event, not the sort of occasion where an empress appears. I arranged to be present anyway, because I had learned, in 11 years of not existing, that presence matters in ways that transcend protocol. That showing up when you are not required to show up is a kind of language, and I had things to say. He was surprised to see me. The expression was the same recalibration I had seen in the corridor, the brief reorganization of a composed man around an unexpected variable. Underneath it, this time, there was something additional. Something that I can only describe as the particular satisfaction of a person who has done serious work and has been told, by someone with direct knowledge of its consequences, that the work was the right work, that it mattered not in the way that generates ceremony and recognition, which I could see he was genuinely indifferent to, but in the quieter way, that serious things matter, the way that changes what is true. I stood beside him for the photograph the Colonial Division's records office required documentation archive. He was a head taller than me. He had the slightly self-conscious posture of a person who is present for official, photographs infrequently, and has not developed a comfortable relationship with them. The photograph looks, I am told, two colleagues at a professional function, which is precisely what it is, and which is precisely why it is the one I keep. Afterward, in the reception that followed, I told him that the South Karen House intended to establish a formal relationship with the Colonial Division, that, as a consequence of the authentication work, my house had developed a significant interest in ensuring that non-integrated archival records were properly maintained and cross-referenced and intended to provide resources toward that end. This was true. It was also a way of saying something else, in the register of institutional language, that I had not forgotten, that gratitude is not a transient thing, and that what he had done had earned a response proportionate to what it was. He said, in the dry and careful way that I had already begun to recognize as his characteristic register, that will be useful. There are a significant number of non-integrated archives in the Colonial Division's jurisdiction. Most of them have never been systematically cross-referenced. Then, we have a great deal of work to do, I said. He looked at me with the measuring directness I had come to expect, taking the information in. And then something shifted in it, slightly, a relaxation of a habitual caution, as though a door that was usually kept precisely ajar had been permitted to open a fraction further. Not a smile, exactly. Something that lived in the territory adjacent to a smile and chose not to formalize itself. The look of a man who has spent most of his professional life in the company of documents. which do not require him to be anything other than precise, and who is finding himself in a conversation that might require something additional, and deciding that this is acceptable. "We do," he said. "Shh. Let me tell you what I know about Corvin Most now, having known him for the years that have accumulated since this corridor outside the Meridian Tribunal. He is a man who does not make large gestures. He does not require recognition for the work he does, which is not the same as being indifferent to whether the work is good. He cares about the work with the kind of quiet intensity that is apparent to anyone who has watched him work, anyone who has sat across a table from him, while he reads a document and sees the particular stillness that comes over him when he finds what he was looking for, the fractional pause before he marks it. He is the kind of man who, when he has determined that something is correct, says so, and when he has determined that something is not correct, does something about it, and who requires no audience for either. He has a habit of being the last person to leave any room where work is still unfinished, and the first to arrive when the work resumes. He has strong opinions about archival cross-referencing methodology that he expresses with a precision I have come to find, I confess, disproportionately compelling. He is not comfortable in courts and formal settings, though he is capable in them, as he showed clearly enough, and he is most himself in the smaller spaces, the records offices, the consultation rooms, the corridors between the important rooms, where the unglamorous maintenance of the truth actually happens. Found me when the record said I did not exist. He found me not because he was looking for me, but because he was looking, which is the different thing, and the more important thing. He was looking because looking is his work, and his work is the work of keeping the record honest, and he had found in the record a dishonesty that he could not set aside, so he did not set it aside. He spent 7 weeks following it, and then he walked into a galactic court and said, in the unhurried voice of a man presenting evidence to a body that should have had it long before, that the record was wrong, and here was the proof, and here was the proof of the proof, and here were 12 more documents supporting both. Been told by people who does these things that the story of the South Karen restoration is a story about the limits of centralized record keeping, or about institutional overreach and its eventual consequences, or about the legal architecture of recognition within the galactic administrative framework. These readings are not wrong. They simply fail to account for the part of the story that happened in a records gallery on a Tuesday afternoon, when a human's archivist in a gray uniform raised his hand at the back of the room. The story, the actual story, is about a man who found a census and followed it for 7 weeks because the record was wrong, and making the record right was his job. And he took his job seriously, in the way that very few people take anything seriously, which is to say without any expectation that anyone would notice, or thank him, or that the noticing and thanking would in any way alter whether the thing was worth doing. They did not strip my name from his records. He had no name to strip. He was a human archivist in the colonial division of an imperial adjacent record service, and his name existed in exactly the kind of mundane, peripheral, non-integrated archive that the architects of the erasure had never thought to audit. He existed in the same kind of document he used to find me. That seems right to me. That seems like the kind of symmetry that does not get designed into things, but is sometimes found in them anyway. Is a day, some years after the tribunal, after the correction panel, after the slow work of reconstitution, there is a day I return to often in my memory. Not the day of the ruling, though that day was significant. Quieter day. We are in one of the compact's archival facilities on one of the outer settlement worlds, because the cross-referencing project has reached that archive, and the cross-referencing project is now the work that fills the space between the larger formal obligations of my restoration. The formal work that takes place in the rooms between the corridors, while the corridor work takes place in the corridors. The archive is the kind of building I have come to love in the years since. Low-ceilinged, practical, staffed by people who care about their work with the same unceremonious seriousness I first encountered on Meridian Station. It smells of properly maintained old documents, which is not a glamorous smell, but is a good one. The smell of things being kept. It is late in the day. The light through the archive's small windows is the color of late afternoon on a world that is primarily farmland, which is a warm and particular gold that has nothing imperial about it. He is reading a transport manifest from 60 years ago, part of a population movement that may or may not have implications for a separate matter we are investigating. He has the stillness he gets when he is working. The quality of complete and unhurried attention that I have described before, and that I have come to regard as one of the more reliable things about him. I watch him read. He is aware that I am watching him, and he does not look up from the document. Because looking up would break the thread of the reading, and the reading is important. He trusts me enough not to manufacture attention he does not currently have. That trust is itself a kind of recognition. The recognition of a man who has understood that you do not require him to be anything other than because what he is, as it turns out, is the thing that was needed. He finishes the page. He turns it over. He reads the next one. I am alive. I am in a document that says so. The document won by a man in a gray uniform who decided that the record being wrong was his problem, who resolved the problem with 7 weeks of quiet, unremarkable, consequential work. The record does not forget, Arbiter Solvither said, simply because it has been asked to. She was right. And she was right because of the records that the asking never reached, the mundane and frugal documents that sat in human archives for 60 years, holding the truth in the unsentimental language of administrative notation, waiting for someone who knew how to read them and cared enough to look. He looked. I am here because he looked. That is all. That is everything. That is the only record that matters. I want to go back now to the 11 years between the erasure and the tribunal, because that span of time is part of the record too, and the record should be complete. When a name is removed from the Imperial Register of Living Persons, it does not happen all at once. That is what I had not understood before it happened to me. I had known, abstractly, that administrative death was a legal mechanism, a formal procedure, a set of document amendments that propagated through interconnected systems with whatever speed the systems allowed. What I had not known was the texture of it, the way it moves through a life, not in a wave but in a slow infiltration, the way the erasure finds you through the small nodes of daily existence, the systems you did not think of as systems, because they were simply the infrastructure of being a person. I became aware of it first through a financial instrument, a transfer request that I initiated through my house's banking intermediary, in what I thought were the early days of the difficulty. Before I understood that what was beginning was not a difficulty but a transformation, intermediary returned the request with a notation that the account holder could not be verified against the current register. I assumed an error. I submitted a correction. The correction was returned with the same notation. I escalated. The escalation reached an official who told me, particular professional regret of someone delivering news they have been instructed to deliver in a way that forecloses further inquiry, that the register showed no record of a person matching my credentials. The register was definitive. I was invited to apply through the standard process for individuals seeking recognition. The standard process for individuals seeking recognition assumes the individual is new, recently born, recently arrived, recently elevated from some status the register had not previously tracked. It does not assume the individual has been removed. It has no category for that, because administrative removal was not, at the time I encountered it, a thing the law officially acknowledged as possible. The law said that the register was amended, from time to time, to reflect administrative actions. The law did not say what corrections could be made, or who could authorize them. These things are clearer now, as a direct consequence of the Soth Karen restoration, and I am glad they are clearer, though clarity arrived too late for me personally. I spent the first 4 months trying to correct the record through official channels, because I did not yet understand that the record had been deliberately corrupted and that the channels were controlled by the people who had corrupted it. I submitted 12 separate applications for register correction. Each was denied, on grounds that shifted slightly from application to application, in the way that arbitrary grounds shift when someone is generating justifications. The fact I attempted 3 times to access my house's formal legal archive to retrieve the primary documents that would have established my identity independently of the register. Each attempt was denied on security grounds. The security system had been updated, I was told. My credentials were not recognized. I was invited to contact the house's new administrator to request access. The house's new administrator was Preeth's employer. I stopped using official channels. What followed was the education that a removed person receives from the world as it is, rather than the world as it is supposed to be. I learned which systems cross-referenced the imperial register, which was nearly all of them, eventually, cause the register is the foundational identity document of the galactic administrative framework, and nearly everything that requires knowing who you are eventually traces back to it. I learned which systems had their own independent verification, which was a small number, and decreasing, as the administrative reorganization that had erased me proceeded to consolidate verification functions under the register's authority. I learned how to construct a life at the edges of systems, using the credentials that still worked, in the places that had not yet been updated. Also learned, over time, what had happened to the people who had been part of the Soth Karen administration before the erasure. Not all of them. I did not have the resources to track everyone, and some of them had taken deliberate steps to become untraceable, either for their own safety, or because they had decided that what I was doing was too dangerous, and they wanted no association with it. But I found some of them. A chamberlain who was living on a frontier world under a service identity, doing administrative work for a shipping collective that did not ask too many questions about his background. A military officer who had resigned her commission when the reorganization reached her division, and who was working in private security in a city on a neutral station, and who, when I found her, looked at me for a long time without speaking, and then said my full title and my full name, which no one had said to me in 2 years. Was the first time since the erasure that I understood what it costs to have a name removed. Not the legal cost, not the material cost, the other cost. The one that lives in the recognition a person receives from other people. The one that says, you are real and I know you. The one that the register takes with it when it is amended. I am telling this because the 11 years were not a period I endured passively. I was building a case. I was assembling documentation, following leads, finding former allies, questing depositions from people who were willing to give them. I was doing what the law permitted me to do from outside the law's usual structures, which is a constrained and frustrating set of activities, but not an empty one. I found the elder from the Veth Protectorate. I found my first chamberlain, who gave his deposition 2 years before his death. Found the specialist who provided the lineage mark provenance affidavit. I found Velashan, agreed to take the case, and prepared it with the thoroughness it deserved. What I did not find in 11 years was the document that would break open the sealed system. The document that existed outside the system's jurisdiction, in an archive the system had never thought to audit. I did not find it because I was looking inside the network the erasure was designed to control. I was looking in the right kind of documents but the wrong kind of archive. I knew the thing I needed existed somewhere, 'cause things that actually happened leave traces, and the traces do not all live in the same place. But I could not find where the traces lived that were beyond the erasure's reach. Corvan Mistay found them because he was looking somewhere else for something else. And he found them because he noticed what they meant, and he followed them because noticing and following is what he does. I have thought often about the 7 weeks he spent on that work. The 7 weeks between the threshold station registry and the tribunal. What that period looked like from his side. He has described it to me, in the direct and unsentimental way he describes things, and what it looked like was this. He found the first document, recognized the name, recognized the significance, and then spent an evening cross-referencing the compact's internal indices to determine how far the trail ran. When the cross-references came back, he had 4 documents. He requested access to the physical holdings for those 4 to authenticate the originals rather than relying on digital copies. That process took 2 weeks because the holdings were in a facility with a quest queue. While he waited, he expanded the index search and found 6 more. When the physical access was granted, He authenticated all 10, while requesting access to the remaining 4. He compiled the provenance chain for each document simultaneously with the research, because he anticipated that provenance would be challenged. He filed the research under a neutral case designation, the inheritance, or dispute he had been working on, because he did not want the compact system flagging a search pattern that might reach the wrong administrator, for he was ready. He did not tell anyone what he had found until he walked into the tribunal. When I asked him about that, about the risk, about what would have happened if the wrong person had found out what he was doing before the hearing, he thought about it with the kind of consideration he gives to factual questions. I didn't think it would be found, he said. The search pattern wasn't unusual enough to flag. Was careful about how I requested access. He paused, and if it had been found, it would have ended the case. He paused again. The documents would still have existed. That last sentence is very like him. The documents would still have existed. It is the answer of a man who understands that the truth is not destroyed when it is suppressed. That the things that happened leave traces whether or not those traces are consulted. Whether or not the people who have an interest in suppression are powerful enough to prevent the consultation. The truth existed in the Compact's archive for 60 years before anyone looked at it with the particular attention it deserved. It would have continued to exist whether or not he found it, whether or not the tribunal was ever held. The finding mattered, but the existing mattered first. I think about that when the restoration is difficult, which is sometimes. The reconstitution of something broken proves harder than anticipated, which it frequently does. When the institutions that adjusted to my absence resist readjusting to my presence, which they sometimes do, I think about the documents in the archive. Holding what was true, waiting without impatience. I think about the particular patience of accurate records, the way they do not require anyone to believe them in order to remain true. And I think about the man who found them, who trusted them, who brought them into the room where they could do what they had always been capable of doing, which was simply to say, this is what happened. Solveth was right. The record does not forget. And the record, it turns out, keeps itself in many places, in the large systems and the small ones, in the central archives and the peripheral ones, in the documents that powerful people remember to alter, and the ones they never thought to check. The erasure was thorough. It just wasn't complete. Maste knew where the incomplete part was. That is the whole of it, and the whole of it is enough. There is something I want to add to the record, because the record should include things that official summaries leave out. Treat. In the first month after the tribunal ruling, before the correction panel had begun its work in earnest, I was living in a temporary residence on Meridian Station. Not the accommodations that befit my station, which were not yet available to a woman whose legal restoration was in process. A serviceable set of rooms in the administrative district that Velashan had arranged through a contact who asked no awkward questions. It was a period of enormous procedural activity and very little certainty, the kind of period that is busy in the way that waiting is busy, full of motion without resolution, full of the small concrete tasks that give a person something to do while the larger thing is pending. I saw Corvin Muste several times during that month because the correction panel's initial proceedings required his testimony about the documents and their provenance, and Meridian Station was his base of operations. We met in the Colonial Division's offices, which are in the administrative wing of the station, and we sat across tables in conference rooms that smelled of recycled air and old paper, and the particular institutional neutrality of rooms that have been used for a large number of serious conversations and retain the residue of none of them. We worked through the provenance chains, document by document, preparing for the challenges we anticipated, and the work was precise and often tedious, and I found it, to my own mild surprise, one of the more grounding activities of that uncertain period. He is a good person to work with, in the way that a small number of people are genuinely good to work with. Not goodness of agreeable, or easy but good in the sense of reliable. In the sense that when he says something is true, it is true, and when he says something is uncertain, it is uncertain, and the line between those two states is never blurred for the sake of reassurance or convenience. I had not had that, reliably, for a long time. It is a quality I had not realized I was missing until I encountered it again. On the last day of that first month, at the end of a long session that had concluded the preliminary provenance documentation. We were in one of those conference rooms, and the work was done. And there was a moment of quiet that was the quiet of completion, rather than the quiet of tension. He was reviewing his notes, with the methodical attention he gives everything he reviews, and I was looking at the documents stacked between us. And I was thinking about the elder, from the Veth Protectorate who had testified for me, and been dismissed, and the chamberlain who had given his deposition 2 years before his death, and all the people who had tried to help me in the 11 years, when the official world had decided to look past me. They had not found what Corvan Maste had found. But they had tried, each of them, with what they had, in the systems they could access, under the constraints of their own circumstances. The record of that trying is part of the record too. He looked up from his notes. He noticed, with the noticing he does not announce, that something had shifted in the room. "The elder," I said, "the one whose testimony was struck. I want to find a way to formally acknowledge what she contributed." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about this not as a sentiment, but as a practical matter, which is how he thinks about most things. "There may be a mechanism through the correction panel," he said. "If her testimony was struck on procedural grounds that the panel finds were improperly applied, which they may, given the authentication findings, it could be reinstated into the record. A reinstated testimony is a form of acknowledgement." It was, I thought, exactly the right kind of acknowledgement, not ceremonial, not decorative, real. A correction of the record rather than a gesture toward it. "Yes," I said, "that's what she would have wanted." He made a note. "That is a small thing." But the small things are also part of the record, and I include them because I am trying to give a complete account rather than a heroic one. Heroic accounts leave out the conference rooms in the notes and the moment when someone notices that something matters and writes it down. They leave out the work that precedes the recognition and continues after it. They give the impression that the significant moment is sufficient, that the hour in the tribunal is the whole of the story, and it is not. The significant moment is only significant because of everything that surrounds it, before and after. The elder's testimony was reinstated into the record by the correction panel 4 months later. She was informed of the reinstatement through a formal notification, and the notification used her full name and her proper honorific. And I was told that she received it in the way that a person receives a thing they had given up hoping for, with a stillness that is not the stillness of indifference, but the stillness of something returning that had been gone long enough to be mourned. That is also part of the record. And the record is what remains when everything else has been said.